It was August of 1950 in the southeastern corner of South Korea, in the last part of the country that was still being held. The ground there made a rough rectangle, about 100 miles from north to south, and about 50 from east to west, and nearly all of it was hills. On 3 sides there was water, the Naktong River along the west, the Sea of Japan along the east, the Korea Strait along the south. Along the 4th side, running north from above Wagwon to the coastal town of Yongdok, an irregular line went up through the mountains, and men were living on it. Inside that rectangle there was one port. Almost everything the line was fought with had come ashore at Pusan and gone north from there on a single main railway and a handful of narrow roads. The army holding the line kept its headquarters at Taegu, 10 miles east of the river it was defending. There was no ground behind them. A line can give way in most places and be rebuilt farther back, and for the whole of July, this one had been doing exactly that, falling back from one river to the next, a day at a time, trading ground for the days it took the ships to arrive. Here it could not. Farther back was the port, and after the port, the sea. They held it for 6 weeks. This is the complete story of the Pusan Perimeter. The summer the line stopped moving, and the work of the men who kept it where it was. Before we settle in for the night, if long, quiet history like this helps you rest, a like or a subscription helps. The Long Watch reach other people who fall asleep to the past. An episode like this one takes weeks of reading and assembling, and that one small tap genuinely keeps the watch going. Now get comfortable. There is no hurry in any of this, and nothing in the next 2 hours needs to be remembered. We are going to start where the men on the ground had to start, with the country itself, the way the hills divide it, the few roads that run between them, and the harbor at the bottom of the peninsula that all of it would come to depend on. Along the eastern coast of Korea, the mountains come down to the water. The high Taebaek Range runs the whole length of that coast, falling off slowly in elevation toward the south, and its crests stand 5,000 to 6,000 feet high, within about 10 miles of the sea. The cliffs on that shore look as though they had come out of the water wet. There are almost no harbors on the east side of the country. The ground leaves the sea no room. The main chain runs from the Yahlu in the north, down the eastern side of the country, to the neighborhood of Pusan. A little south of the waste a spur leaves it and goes diagonally away to the southwest, toward Mokpo on the far coast. Everything else is lesser ranges and the foothills that come off them, and the valleys between them run mostly north and south, the way the ranges do. The peninsula runs between 525 and 600 miles end to end, and it is nowhere wide. South of Seoul it averages about 150 miles across, and almost all of that width is hills. 21 million people lived in the southern half, on the fifth of the country that could be farmed, and they lived where the ground was flat, which was where the roads were. Almost all of Korea south of the narrow waist tilts west, away from the Taebaek. That tilt sets the watersheds, and it sets the direction of every river that matters, because the significant streams all run west or southwest off the western slopes of the eastern ranges. From north to south they are the Yalu, the Chongchon, the Han, the Kum above Taejon, and the wandering Naktong, which runs west and south around the city of Taegu, and then turns east to reach the Korea Strait near Pusan. The few wide valleys lie mostly toward the western coast, and the larger rivers run out through them to the west and the south. None of them carries much traffic. They are wide enough and deep enough to stand in the way of anything moving across the country. And in the monsoon season, the flooding makes that worse. Where the rivers are, the roads and the railways have to find a bridge or a ford. Where the eastern shore has no harbors, the southern and the western coasts are cut and indented and have many. Pusan lies at the southeastern corner of the country, at the end of that indented coast. It also lay close to Japan. From the nearest Japanese port, the run to Pusan was 110 sea miles. About a fifth of Korea was arable, and most of that fifth lay in the south and the west. Rice came first among the food crops, then barley, then soybeans, and the rice was mostly southern, where a long warm season gave 2 crops in a year. Every mountain valley in the country had been terraced and irrigated. Nothing was wasted by farmers who worked each inch of the lowland flats, the paddies and the terraced slopes. The paddies went a long way up. On the western slopes they were terraced as high as 5,000 feet, and they lay hard against the roads and the rail lines, so that moving off a road meant moving through standing water and mud walls. 7 of every 10 Koreans worked the land. In the south, the density came to 586 people to the square mile, one of the highest figures in the world for a farming country. The earth in those valleys is coarse and red. Where they open out, the railway and the narrow dirt road run side by side on embankments 8 to 10 feet above neatly ruled fields, and a belt of paddy 3/4 of a mile wide lies between one line of grass hills and the next. In the towns, dirt streets and thatched huts on the outskirts stand within sight of modern office buildings, factories, and streetcars. There were about 20,000 miles of vehicular road in Korea, and all of it was secondary by American or European measure. Even the best of it was narrow and badly drained, surfaced with gravel or with rock that had been broken up by hand and then worked down into the dirt roadbed by the traffic passing over it. By engineer specification, there was not one 2-lane road in the country. The road net, like the rail net, ran mainly north and south, with few connections running east and west. Aside from the corridor routes that led inland from Seoul and from Pyongyang, the lateral communications of Korea were for the most part little better than mountain trails. Both roads and railroads followed the riverbeds and the valleys. Where the ground rose, the road generally went over it and the railroad went through it in tunnels. Korean road traffic was predominantly by ox cart. Hard-surfaced roads were few and far between, and the ordinary earth roads turned into bogs in the monsoon season. The country moved at the pace of a cart and a team, along tracks laid out for a cart and a team. From Pusan, a good railroad ran north through Daegu and Taejon to Seoul, and on toward the Yalu, and the country had some 3,500 miles of standard gauge track, with branch lines off it to the west and the northeast. The 2 airstrips that mattered were short and rough. The one at Pusan was a little under 5,000 feet of concrete wash, over 4 inches of broken stone, and the one at Daegu, 3,800 feet of clay and gravel. The Naktong is the second largest river in Korea. It doubles back on itself over and over on its way south, and along its lower course, it runs generally from 1/4 to half a mile wide, and more than 6 feet deep. Great sand beaches appear at many places along it when the river is not swollen by rain. Hills come down close to the water's edge on either bank, and rice paddy valleys of varying sizes finger their way among the hills. What counted as a hill depended on who was speaking. To the soldiers who came to this country, the word meant anything from a rise in a field to a high mountain, and they used it for both without much distinction. Summer cloud over the country is generally thick, and fog and haze cut the visibility further, worst in the first half of the day. From above, one ridge looks like the next, and a flyer could rarely tell which one he was over. On the ground, the problem took another form. There were not enough maps to go round, and much of the work had to be done on outdated Japanese sheets. In October of 1949, the defense minister of the Republic of Korea asked the American Advisory Group for 189 26 tanks. The request was turned down, and the reason given was the ground. Korean terrain and the condition of the roads and the bridges were held to be unsuitable for the effective employment of tanks. 8 months later, tanks came south along those same roads, and in the plan that brought them all, the attacks were to be made along the main roads. In the summer of 1950, the American Army in the Far East was spread across the islands of Japan on occupation duty. The 7th Infantry Division held Hokkaido and the northern third of Honshu. The 1st Cavalry Division, an infantry division under an older name, sat in the crowded central plain around Tokyo. The 25th Division held the southern third of Honshu from Osaka. The 24th Division was on Kyushu, the southernmost island, its headquarters at Kokura, across the strait from Korea. All four were under the 8th Army, and the 8th Army was commanded by Lieutenant General Walton Walker. On paper, they were 4 divisions. In men, they carried on average about 70% of their full wartime strength. 3 of them stood between 12 and 13,000 men. 1 stood a little over 15,000. The shortage had the same shape nearly everywhere. Every division in the Army except one in Europe was short a battalion in each of its infantry regiments, 2 rifle battalions instead of 3, with matching shortages through the other combat arms. The artillery battalions had been cut in men and in weapons as well, and each of them had 2 firing batteries instead of 3. There was one exception in all of Japan. The 24th Infantry Regiment of the 25th Division had its full 3 battalions, and the Field Artillery Battalion supporting it had its full 3 firing batteries. Everywhere else, a regiment on the rolls was 2/3 of a regiment. The divisions did not have their full wartime complement of recoilless rifles, the 57mm or the 75, or of 4.2-inch mortars. The tank companies had the light M24. Almost all the military equipment and transport in the Far East had been repaired and reissued, and nearly all of it had already served somewhere else before. Training had gone as far as the ground in Japan allowed it to go. Most units had trained through the battalion level, though some battalions had not passed their tests. Training and maneuvers at regimental, division, and army level had not been held at all. One reason was crowding. There were no training areas in Japan of a size for exercises like that. The condition of the weapons was uneven. In the 24th Division at the beginning of July, some carbines were found unserviceable, and many of the 60mm mortars were unusable because the bipods and tubes were worn out. Trip flares were short, hand grenades were short, and the 60mm illuminating shells that existed were old enough that between 50 and 60% of them failed to work. The anti-tank weapon in the hands of the infantry was the 2.36-inch rocket launcher. A larger one existed on paper. The 3.5-inch launcher had been under development since 1945, and none had ever been issued to troops because its ammunition had proved difficult to perfect. That ammunition had been standardized in production for 15 days when the Korean War began. The new launcher was made of aluminum and weighed about 15 pounds. It looked like a 5-foot length of stovepipe. It was fired electrically and threw a rocket 23 inches long and 8.5 pounds in weight from a smooth, open tube. The destructive part of the rocket was its shaped charge, designed to burn through the armor of any tank then known. The army on the other side of the strait was younger than the equipment. The Korean Constabulary became the Army of the Republic of Korea in August of 1948, and by January of 1949, it had passed 60,000 men. At the outbreak of the war, it stood at about 98,000. Some 65,000 of them combat troops, and the rest headquarters and service. It had 8 divisions, and only 4 of them were anywhere near the 10,000 men a division was supposed to hold. 5 had 3 regiments each, 2 had only 2 regiments, and 1 had 2 regiments and a battalion. In the early summer of 1950, the 4 best stood on the parallel, and a regiment of the Capital Division held the Ongjin Peninsula beyond their western flank. The other 4 were scattered through the interior and the south, 3 of them working against guerrillas. The divisions on the parallel carried the M1 rifle and the .30 caliber carbine, 60 mm and 81 mm mortars, 2.36-inch rocket launchers, 37 mm anti-tank guns, and the M305 mm howitzer. The M3 was the short-barreled piece from the infantry cannon companies, and its effective range was 7,250 yards. The standard howitzer of the same caliber reached 12,500. 91 of the M3s were on hand on the 15th of June. 89 were serviceable. What that army did not have at all is the shorter list. It had no tanks. It had no medium artillery, no 4.2-inch mortars, no recoilless rifles, and neither fighters nor bombers. Its heavier weapons came to 27 armored cars, something more than 700 artillery pieces and mortars, about 140 anti-tank guns, and approximately 1,900 of the 2.36-inch bazookas. The ammunition on hand for the artillery and the mortars would have been used up in a few days of fighting. About 15% of the weapons and 35% of the vehicles were unserviceable, and the 6-month stock of spare parts that had come with the equipment was gone. Most units had finished their training at company level and were training at battalion level. North of the parallel, the Army was 2 years older and had been assembled differently. The Korean People's Army was formed in February of 1948. By June of 1950, it had 8 infantry divisions at full strength, 2 more at about half strength, a separate infantry regiment, a motorcycle reconnaissance regiment, and an armored brigade. 5 of the divisions and the armored brigade had well-trained men in them, and about a third of the whole army had served in the Chinese Communist armies. 2 divisions had come over whole from China in 1949, and in the half-year before the invasion the force doubled. The armor was 1 brigade. In June of 1950, the 105th Armored Brigade had 6,000 men and 120 T-34 tanks, in 3 tank regiments of 40 tanks apiece, with a motorized infantry regiment of about 2,500 men. Another 30 tanks joined a division in the east just before the crossing. That made 150 T-34s in all, every one of them of Russian make. The T-34 weighed 32 tons. It was low, wide-tracked, and heavily armored, and it carried an 85 mm gun and 2 machine guns. The artillery behind it was Soviet as well, and a division of that army counted 48 divisional pieces, 122 mm howitzers, 76 mm guns, and self-propelled 76s. The 76 mm divisional gun reached beyond 14,000 yards, several thousand yards farther than anything on the southern side of the parallel. A division of the Republic of Korea had 15 howitzers. None of this was generally understood on the American side before the invasion. The feeling, apparently shared by the chief of the advisory group, was that the Army of the Republic of Korea would beat off an attack without much trouble. The commander of the 8th Army held no such view of his own troops. Walker went to Korea knowing the limits of what he had in training, in equipment, and in numbers. On the night of the 30th of June 1950, at Camp Wood on Kyushu, the commander of the 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry, went to bed at 9 o'clock. An hour and a half later, his regimental commander telephoned and told him to report to the command post. By 3 in the morning, his men were on trucks, driving 75 miles to the airfield at Itazuke. Through the monsoon rain, 6 transport aircraft were available for the lift. The first 2, arriving over the small runway near Pusan, found it closed in with fog and turned back. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith was on the second aircraft and did not get down in Korea until the 10th flight. 406 men were carried in by air that day. What came off the airplanes was 2 understrength rifle companies, half of a headquarters company, and half of a communications platoon. The composite platoon had 4 recoilless rifles, and 2 of them were flown in. Each man carried 120 rounds and 2 days of rations. Perhaps 1 man in 6 had been in combat before, and most were 20 years old or less. 3 miles above Osan, the highway ran through a low saddle, and a ridge of hills crossed the road there at right angles. Its highest point stood 300 feet above the flat, and from it the highway and the railroad were in view almost the whole 8 miles to Suwon. A little after midnight on the 5th of July, the force left Pyeongtaek. The Korean drivers of the requisition trucks left when they learned they were going north, so American soldiers took the wheels. 12 miles took 2.5 hours, blacked out, on a road full of people walking south. The force was in place about 3, and by first light it was not fully dug in. Behind the infantry, Lieutenant Colonel Miller Perry put 4 howitzers 2,000 yards back, over a trail that only jeeps could travel, 2 jeeps in tandem dragging each gun into place. The 5th he set forward as an anti-tank gun, halfway to the infantry. A 6th had stayed at Pyeongtaek with a broken tractor. There were about 1,200 rounds on the battery position, and nearly all of it was high explosive. The armor piercing came to 6 rounds, and all 6 went to the forward gun. That was what the ammunition officer had drawn at Sasebo. 18 rounds, the whole stock in the depot, of which this battery received 6. There were no anti-tank mines anywhere in Korea. The 5th of July dawned raining. On the position were 540 Americans, 406 of them infantry, and 134 artillery. With the first light, the infantry test-fired their weapons. The gunners registered the howitzers, and then everyone ate a ration. A little after 7, Smith saw movement far up the road, and half an hour later the column was plain. 8 tanks, coming down toward the saddle. The call for fire reached the battery about 8, and the first 2 rounds went out from gun number 2. General Barth looked at his watch. 16 minutes past 8. The observer corrected quickly, and the shells began to fall among the tanks. The infantry could see that the tanks were not slowing down, At 700 yards, the two recoilless rifles made direct hits and apparently did no damage. When the leading tanks came almost abreast of the infantry, Lieutenant Ali Connor fired 22 rockets from a ditch beside the road, from about 15 yards, into the rear of them, where the armor is thinner. Whether they were effective is doubtful. Two of the tanks stopped just beyond the pass under the direct fire of the single forward howitzer, and one of them caught fire. Very likely the artillery shells stopped those two, though the rockets at close range may have damaged their tracks. What was left after 6 rounds was high explosive, and it ricocheted off the wet tanks. The third tank through the saddle destroyed the forward gun. By 9, the last of them had passed the infantry. There were 33 tanks in all, moving in groups of 4 at short intervals, and they did not stop to fight. They fired as they went by. One was left burning, one was damaged so that it could not move. 2 were stopped by the artillery in front of the battery, and 3 were hit but got away. 4 out of 33. At the battery, the tanks halted behind a knoll 500 yards short, then came past one at a time with hatches closed. The howitzers fired at 150 to 300 yards, and the shells shook them and bounced off. 2 men were hit there, Perry among them, and he went on giving orders from where he was. On the ridge, about 20 of the infantry had been killed or wounded. Then the road was quiet, and nothing moved on it toward Suwon. About an hour later, Smith saw a column of trucks and marching infantry come out of the distance, and he put its length at some 6 miles. At 11:45, when the head of it was 1,000 yards off, he opened with everything he had. The trucks burned, and about 1,000 men came off them and spread out. American fire broke up every attempt to come at the ridge from the front. And what the enemy infantry did instead was go around it on both sides. By 2:30, the small arms ammunition was nearly gone. There were enemy already moving toward the rear, and a tank force stood behind him. The telephone wire had been cut by the first tanks. The radios were wet, and by 11 there had been no communication at all. They came off the hill by leapfrogging, each bound covered by the fire of the unit ahead of it. One platoon of B Company never received the order, and learned from a runner that the ground behind it was empty. The men carried rifles and 2 or 3 magazines apiece, and everything crew served stayed where it was. The heaviest losses of the day came on the way out, and not on the position. Smith crossed the paddies to find Perry, expecting the howitzers destroyed. Every gun on the battery position was serviceable, and the trucks hidden in the yards north of Osan were nearly untouched. Around the turn at the southern edge of the town, the lead vehicle came out in front of 3 tanks stopped in the road, some of their crews standing beside them, smoking. The column turned around without firing a shot, left Osan by the northern edge, and reached Ansong after dark. There was no pursuit. The enemy infantry moved onto the abandoned positions and began collecting what had been left there. In the morning at Chonan, the count came to 185 men, and about 150 of the infantry were missing. Men kept walking in for days afterward, and one of them came into Pusan on a Korean sampan from the west coast. An unidentified machine gunner probably was the first American ground soldier killed in action in Korea. Whether the column on the road that morning knew that American ground troops had arrived in Korea and were in front of it is not known. The officer leading the tanks may have thought that he had met only one more minor South Korean delaying position. Pyeongtaek stood about 40 miles south of Seoul, on the main road and the main railroad. with a small river running past the northern edge of the town and the highway crossing it on a bridge. South of that river, the peninsula broadens westward some 45 miles, and a road net spreads out through it. While the road at Pyeongtaek was held, there is one line to hold. Below it there were several. On the afternoon of the 5th of July, a lieutenant took a few men north with rocket launchers. 5 miles below Osan, they found tank tracks turned around in the mud, and a South Korean soldier rode up shouting at them to go back. Private Kenneth Shadrick was killed in the exchange that followed, about 4 o'clock. At 3 the next morning, the highway bridge north of the town went down. The 6th came up in fog and rain, with water standing in the foxholes, when a platoon sergeant heard an engine. On the far side of the gap stood the shapes of tanks, and behind them a thin line of infantry, walking in column of twos. The leading tank stopped at the gap, and the others closed up behind it until the sergeant had counted 13. What the bridge had bought was not a battle but a halt. The infantry did not wait for it. They walked around the tanks and crossed the stream on both sides of the span, and within half an hour men of A Company could watch them loading their rifles. The mortars fired into the bridge area and destroyed a truck, and then a tank round took out the mortar observer, and nobody picked up the correction. Colonel Ayres ordered the companies back, and by mid-morning the battalion was on the road to Chonan, equipment scattered behind it. The distances between Ansong, Pyeongtaek, and Songhwan-ni were too great for the command radios to work in net, and refugees walking south cut lengths from the telephone wire for carrying straps. What was left was liaison officers and runners. At Chonan, the defense went in 2 miles south of the town. By the morning of the 7th, only South Korean police were left in the streets. At 6 that evening, the 34th Infantry changed commanders, and Colonel Martin came up from Taejon without helmet, weapon, or equipment to take it over. Near dawn on the 8th, 5 or 6 tanks came into Chonan by a secondary road from the northwest. In the streets, the 3rd Battalion reportedly destroyed 2 tanks with rocket launchers and grenades. But by 6 the enemy was in the town, and 2 rifle companies were cut off. At about 8 in the morning, Colonel Martin was killed on the main street. He had taken up a rocket launcher, working as his own gunner, when a tank put its gun on the hut. Between 8 and 10 the artillery laid a continuous white phosphorus screen, and under it part of the battalion came out of the town. The count at the assembly point that afternoon was 175 men. Just south of Chonan the highway forked, one road running southeast to Chochiwon, and the other south to the Kum River at Kongju. Both met again at Taejon, so both had to be held. Dean gave the Chochiwon Road to the 21st Infantry, and the Kongju Road to the 34th, and that evening put the arithmetic into an order. The division would fall back to the south bank of the Kum, 10 miles below Chochiwon, and the river line was to be held at all costs. Stevens was told that help was 4 days away. On the 9th, the engineers blew the bridges in front of Cho Nui, 12 miles below Chonan, where about 500 men held a ridge. By midday, 11 tanks and 200 or 300 infantry came down to it. Aircraft answered the call, and by 10 minutes to 5 of the 11 tanks were reportedly burning. The 10th began with ground fog rising out of the paddies, and the tanks that came through were heard and never seen. At 11:30, American artillery began falling on the ridge. The wire was gone, the observer's radio was dead, and the fire could not be called off. At 12:05, the men came off across flooded paddies on narrow dikes. That afternoon, the 3rd Battalion counterattacked and took the ridge back. Late in the day, a flight found a long column of tanks and vehicles standing bumper to bumper north of the wrecked bridge at Pyeongtaek, and the 5th Air Force reported 38 tanks, 7 half-tracks, and 117 trucks destroyed. North of Chochi-won the next morning, 4 tanks came through a minefield into the 3rd Battalion of the 21st. Mortar fire took out the switchboard and ammunition point, and about 1,000 infantry came around both flanks. It came at the front and around the flank, and roadblocks went in behind. Across the roads the battalion would have come out by. Ammunition could not get forward. Colonel Jensen and his intelligence officer were killed crossing a stream. The battalion lost close to 60% of its strength, and 9/10 of the men who came out had no weapon, no ammunition, and no canteen. At 9:30 on the 12th, an attack of about 2,000 men developed on the last position above Chochi-won, and at noon, Stevens reported he was surrounded, with nothing left to build another position. The companies came out one at a time and were trucked out at Chochi-won. By 4 in the afternoon, the regiment was across the Coombe, and stragglers were still crossing 5 hours later. Between Cho Nui and Chochi-won, the understrength 2 Battalion 21st Infantry had held the road against 2 North Korean divisions for 3 days. It had paid for that in men and equipment, enough for 2 rifle battalions. About 325 men held the new blocking line where the highway crossed the river at Taepyeong-ni. The highway bridges at Kongju and Taepyeong-ni and the railroad bridge upstream were blown on the 12th and 13th. The one at Taepyeong-ni came down only partly and had to be blown again the next morning, when 2 spans finally went into the water. Below Kongju, the reconnaissance company worked 16 miles of bank and destroyed every flat-bottom boat it could find. The crossing came anyway. On the 14th, below Kongju, 2 barges put about 500 men across between 8 and 9:30 and 3 miles south. The 63rd Field Artillery Battalion hit out of the hills, lost 10 howitzers and 60 to 80 vehicles within an hour and a half. At 3 in the morning on the 16th, an aircraft dropped a flare over the river at Taepyeong-ni, and the 3rd Division came across by boat and raft, wading and swimming. 1 howitzer had been assigned to put illumination over the water on call. A request to shift it was misunderstood. The gun had to be relayed, and for much of the crossing there was no light at all. By 8, the positions behind the dike were gone. A roadblock stood 3 miles back on the supply road by then. Dean had asked the regiment to hold until dark, and after dark, it fell back nearer Taejon. Of about 900 men who had been in position along the river, 434 reported for duty near Taejon the next day. What the 16th of July showed was a defending force holding 30 miles of river frontage with 2 battalions and nothing behind them to send anywhere. Taejon stood 100 miles south of Seoul, in a valley running north and south at the western foot of the Sobek Range. The town was long and narrow, with wide rice fields against it on the north and the west, and the railroad came down its eastern side to a station and yards. Of the 5 roads that came in, the Seoul Highway from the northwest had to be counted the most important. About 130,000 people lived there. General Dean had the remnants of 3 defeated regiments, and each of them could muster little more than a battalion. The 19th Infantry had been badly cut about at the Coombe River on the 16th of July and had gone back to Yeongdong to be re-equipped. That left the whole line north and west of the town to the 34th Infantry, which Colonel Charles Beauchamp had flown in from Japan to take over on the 16th. The ground chosen for the close defense lay 3 miles west of the town, a ridge 500 feet high and 3 miles long, behind the Pusan River. It was called the Yusong Position, and each end of it covered a bridge and a road. On the airstrip 2 miles out, Dean combined what was left of his division artillery into one battalion. Dean had no intention of fighting a last-ditch battle for Taejon. He looked on it as another delaying action. On the 18th, he made his plans to leave the next day. Before noon that day, General Walker landed on the airstrip and the plans changed. The 1st Cavalry Division had begun coming ashore that morning at Pohangdong, and Walker wanted the town held until it could come up beside the 24th Division. He said he needed 2 days. The withdrawal was put off by 24 hours. On the 8th of July, Dean had written to Tokyo for the new 3.5-inch rocket launcher, because the men who had used the older launcher against tanks had lost confidence in it. The first of them and an instruction team reached Taejon on the 10th, and the weapons themselves on the 12th, which left about a week. The teams were made up inside the town, where the highway turns east into the built-up streets 700 yards from the western edge. Tanks came down the Yusong Road in the night, about 15 of them, and aircraft knocked out 5 before they reached the town. By 4 in the morning, small arms fire was reaching the Korean house that held the command post of the leading battalion. Colonel Ayres could not raise his forward companies. He sent word to the regiment that tanks were through his position and moving on the town. The position had been broken quickly and could not be held in place. Beauchamp, who had lost touch with that battalion, drove out in a jeep before daylight to see for himself. At the fork half a mile west of the town, a tank came up out of the darkness and fired a burst as he was jumping clear, which went past him and set the jeep burning. He crawled back several hundred yards until he found a 3.5-inch team. The team came up to the fork, set the tank alight, and took its crew. That action at the crossroads, in the dark before the 20th, is the first verifiable use of the new launcher against the T-34. By 11 o'clock, 8 tanks had been destroyed in the town or just outside it, 6 of them by rockets and 2 by artillery. How many tanks came into Taejon during the day cannot be fixed accurately. 3 teams from the reconnaissance company made 7 hits at 30 to 70 yards on 3 tanks and stopped one of them. Near midday, another tank came into the town and went past the regimental command post. Dean took a party after it, and for better than an hour they went over walls and through houses under sniper fire and came in from a backyard to the 2nd floor of a business building. The tank stood below the window. Dean wrote afterward that the muzzle of its gun was no more than a dozen feet away. On his word, the team fired. The 1st round hit, the 3rd finished it, and the party moved off a little and watched it burn. About the same hour, the 2 commanders ate a late lunch of heated ration together, in the belief that their 2 battalions were still in position a mile or 2 west of the town. The battalions were scattered in the hills by then. Apart from a few snipers who had come in among the houses, Taejon was quiet. Dean told Beauchamp he wanted to start out in daylight rather than wait for dark. The head of the column turned the wrong way. The rest went on down the street toward the Osan Road, through a stretch where the houses were burning hard on both sides. Just beyond it, Dean's car and the guard jeep went through a crossing. Clark told him they had missed the Osan turn. Fire would not let them stop and come about. They went on south on the road to Kumsan. The block on the Okechon Highway had been set by elements of 2 regiments that came in from the west and from the south, with no tanks and no artillery. Just clear of the town, the column came under mortar fire, and men left the vehicles for the ditches. An attempt to clear the road under smoke failed, for want of men who could go out into the fire. The men then poured gasoline over most of what was still running, set it alight, and went up into the hills. One of them put about 250 men in a patch of ditch 50 yards by 50, waiting for dark. A mile out on the Kumsan road, Dean stopped at an overturned truck, sent the wounded from it away in his 2 vehicles, and rode on southward with a half-track. A mile farther, a knocked-out truck blocked the road. The men crawled out through bean rows and an orchard to the bank of the Taejon River and lay there until dark. Then they crossed to the west bank and started up a high hill north of a hamlet called Nahtong. A little after midnight, Clark, at the head, found no one behind him. He went back, found several men asleep, and called for the general. Someone said Dean had gone down for water. Clark reckoned a man carrying nothing could go down and come back in an hour, and decided to wait too. Dean did not come back. At 3:15, Clark took the others to the top, and they stayed there through the day, 4 or 5 miles south of Taejon, hoping to see him. Of the 3,933 men of the division engaged at Taejon on the 19th and the 20th, 1,150 were casualties. That is almost 30 in every 100. Company L of the 34th Infantry, which held the rear, lost 107 men out of 153. Nearly all the equipment of the units in the town stayed in it. At noon on the 22nd, the division passed its forward positions at Yongdong to the 1st Cavalry Division. On the same day, 8th Army ordered General Church to take command of the 24th Division. General Dean was still carried as missing. The best port in Korea stood at the southeastern tip of the peninsula, about as far from the fighting as it was possible to be, and still be in the country. Of all the ports in South Korea, Pusan alone had dock facilities able to handle a sizable amount of cargo, and very nearly everything that happened on the line that summer happened because of it. The port itself was 4 piers with stone quays running between them. Alongside them, 24 or more deep-water ships could lie at once and be worked at once. Where the piers ran out there were beaches, and on the beaches there was room to run 14 landing ships aground and open their bow doors. Most of the American supply came across a single one of those piers, the second, and went from there onto flat cars and onto trucks. The unit the Army counted all this in was not a unit of weight. A measurement ton is 40 cubic feet, a unit of room, of how much space a thing occupies in a hold. On a ship, space runs out long before weight does, and a crate of rations and a crate of shells that weigh the same take up nothing like the same amount of it. Through the whole of July, the docks at Pusan took in an average of 10,666 of those tons every day. In the last 16 days of July, 230 ships came into the harbor and 214 went out again. In those same 16 days, 42,581 men came ashore, and 9,454 vehicles came ashore with them. All of that moved without heavy lifting gear, because for most of the month there was none. The first heavy cranes reached Pusan on the 23rd of July. A 60-ton crane and 2 crawler cranes towed 900 miles across the water from Yokohama. A 100-ton crane did not get there until the first week of August. by which time the withdrawal had ended and the perimeter had been drawn. The whole of that July flow, the artillery, the tanks, the rations, the ammunition that would hold the river in August, came up out of the holds and onto the quays before the equipment for lifting it had arrived. The other half of the problem lay on the far side of the strait. Almost everything came from Japan, and Japan is not close. Somebody had to decide, every day, which things could wait their turn in the ordinary flow, and which things could not, and then find a way to move the second kind faster than the first. What they built for that was a train. The Red Ball Express was proposed in the middle of July, and its first run pulled out of Yokohama at 1:30 in the afternoon on the 23rd. 2 days later it was running every day, leaving at 11:30 at night and coming into Sasebo at 5:45 on the second morning, a schedule that put the loading and most of the running in the dark. From Sasebo the load crossed by sea. Yokohama to Sasebo took a little over 30 hours, and Yokohama to Pusan about 53 in all. 2 days and 5 hours from a siding in Japan to a dock in Korea for a crate that could not wait. The Red Ball carried 300 measurement tons a day. Set against 10,000, that is almost nothing, and the smallness is the whole point of it. It was never intended to be volume. It was a way of saying that one particular load was more urgent than the rest, and of making that decision hold good across 900 miles of rail and water. From the docks, everything went onto the railroads, and the railroads were the backbone of the entire system. The main line had been built by the Japanese and ballasted with crushed rock and river gravel, and it ran north out of the port toward Daegu. One branch went west along the south coast through Masan and on to Chinju. Another went northeast up the shore toward Pohang-dong, before turning inland into the mountains. The western branch follows the main road through the Masan corridor most of the way, single track and standard gauge, threading a long series of tunnels and cuts and trestles. It is the sort of line that carries a great deal as long as nothing happens to it, and very little the moment something does. 3 directions out of 1 point, 25 standard gauge locomotives had been bought in Japan for the Korean lines, and on the 18th of July, a ship brought in 3,000 anti-tank mines made by Japanese factories. Both went out of the port on those same 3 lines. There is one night of it we can see closely, because a Marine Brigade came in on it and somebody wrote the evening down. The first ship entered the harbor a little after 5 in the afternoon on the 2nd of August. The last of the group was still being warped onto its mooring at about 9, while a conference went on aboard. As each ship came alongside, the men at the rails were met by a South Korean band playing the Marine Corps hymn, tinny and a little off-key across the water. After dark, the pier became bedlam. Thousands of men came down onto the quays at once, and the cranes and the working parties began lifting off vehicles and supply and equipment, and a running chorus of orders and comments went on underneath the noise of the machinery. Supply points were set up under floodlights, and long lines formed along the docks, through the buildings, and out into the streets. What came off that night gives the flavor of it better than any total. Heavy howitzers and their prime movers. Tanks hauled backwards out of a landing ship dock. Heavy engineer equipment. The mobile repair shops of the ordnance detachment. Fuel, ammunition, medical stores. All of it swung from the decks down onto the concrete and carried off in a hurry to dispersal areas around the port. And then it had to leave. The congestion in the marshalling yards that summer was very nearly indescribable. Units hunting for transport commandeered locomotives, freight cars stood nose to tail on single-track lines. Refugees packed themselves into whatever had room, and general confusion was never far away. The port could put a division ashore in a night. Getting that division out of the town and up the line was a separate problem, and it belonged to different men. Two smaller harbors took a little of the weight off the main one. At Ulsan and at Suyong, ammunition and petroleum products came ashore directly over the beach, out of barges and tankers and landing craft, without any pier involved at all. None of this was dramatic work, and none of it was ever going to be. Ships came in and were emptied and went out again. The cranes arrived late and were put to work. The trains ran at night, and a man on a hillside north of Taegu opened a crate of ammunition in the heat without once thinking about where it had been 8 days earlier, or what it had taken to put it into his hands. By the morning of the 4th of August, there was not a bridge standing across the Naktong along the front of the 8th Army. The engineers had dropped the last of them into the water. The troops on the east bank settled down to watch the crossings and wait, on a river running wide and slow between hills that came down close to the water. The withdrawal behind the river had been ordered on the 1st of August, in a directive that confirmed instructions already given by word of mouth. Preparing for it on the 30th of July, General Walker had told every unit to keep contact with the enemy in front of it. The divisions of the ROK Army came back across on the night of the 2nd and 3rd of August, on a line that bent north and east of Waiguan, matching their movement to the 8th Army's. The last companies of the 21st Infantry crossed the Koryong Bridge at 45 minutes past midnight, and the engineers followed them 2 hours later. The bridges at Waiguan were the most important on the river, and they were the last to go. General Gay, who commanded the 1st Cavalry Division, arranged their destruction himself and ordered that nobody but he could say when they were to be blown. 20 miles down the river, another span had already gone the night before, the one carrying the road from Chogyai across to Changnyong. On the 4th of August, the American and ROK forces took up the positions of the Pusan Perimeter. What those positions enclosed was an area about 100 miles from north to south, and about 50 miles from east to west. The Naktong formed the western boundary, except for the southernmost 15 miles, below the point where the river turns east after taking in the Nam. The Sea of Japan closed the eastern side, and the Korea Strait the southern. The northern boundary was not a boundary anybody had drawn. It was an irregular curved line through the mountains, running from above Waiguan across to Yongdok on the east coast, and it followed whatever ridges the divisions on it could hold. 3 sides of the figure were water. The 4th was hills, and only the stretch along the river was anything like straight. Yongdok on the east coast stood at the northeast corner. Pusan was at the southeast corner, and Masan at the southwest. Taegu lay near the middle of the figure from north to south, and only about 10 miles from the western and threatened side of it. The headquarters of the 8th Army was in Taegu, behind the center of the 1st Cavalry Division's front. From Pusan, Masan is 30 air miles west, and Taegu 55 to the northwest. Those are distances measured across the map and not along the ground, and every load that reached Taegu traveled farther than that. The road and the rail line bent with the valleys. Pohangdong lies 60 air miles northeast of Pusan, and Yongdok 90, except for the delta of the Nahaktong and one east and west valley between Taegu and Pohangdong. The country inside the perimeter is broken and mountainous, and the mountains are worst in the northeast, above Pohangdong. That one valley was the only real crosswise route the figure had. Everything else that went from one side of it to the other went over hills. The ROK Army held the eastern half of the line, from a point just above Wagwan. The 8th Army held the western and southern part. The ROK sector ran about 80 air miles, and the 8th Army's about 65, and the ROK divisions had the most mountainous stretches of it, and the part with the poorest lines of communication. Along the arc from southwest to northeast stood the American 25th, 24th, and 1st Cavalry Divisions in that order, and beyond them 5 divisions of the ROK Army carried the line north and then east to the sea. Each of the 3 American divisions had between 20 and 40 miles of front to defend. The 24th Division zone lay north of the Nam and ran along the east bank for about 40 miles of river. From Wagwan south to Masan, the straight line distance across the American part of the line was 70 miles, and the front itself, following the ground it was laid on, was twice that long. The river helped the side that stood behind it and hindered the side that had to get across it. Along the whole western boundary, it worked as a moat, and the far bank was in other hands. On the near one, the divisions counted their frontages in miles, rather than yards, and every place a man could wade was a place that had to be watched at night. General Walker's defense plan rested on the roads and rail lines that ran in a large oval east of the Naktong, from Pusan north through Miryang to Taegu, then east through Yongchon to Gyeongju, and from Gyeongju back south to Pusan. That oval was the inside of the figure. Any further withdrawal, and the loss of those lines with it, would have made a later attempt at a counter-offensive difficult. What the oval meant was that the distance from one part of the line to any other part ran inside the perimeter, over valley track at close to sea level. Outside it, forces moving from the center of the country to the east coast had 40 air miles of mountains to cross with no improved road anywhere in them. Inside, a regiment could be put on a train. The short way round belonged to the side standing on the inner edge. The line was also shorter than anything that had come before it. The enemy's move around the left flank at the end of July had forced the 8th Army to strengthen its units in the southwest at the expense of the Central Front, and to regroup on a shorter line behind the Naktong. Nothing about the figure had been chosen. It was what was left, and it was the first position of the war that had an inside and an outside. Before the 4th of August, a continuous line had seldom extended beyond a battalion or a regimental position. Both flanks were usually open. Troops moving along the hills could pass around a defended position, and supporting troops were rarely within reach. On the perimeter there were known units to the left and to the right, and some reserves behind. That was the whole of what the shape gave, and it was new. On the 4th of August, the commander of the 24th Division issued an order and required that every man in the division be told it. Defensive and alternate positions were to be prepared, routes reconnoitered, the river patrolled at night, communications perfected, and each individual was to know his job. There would be no withdrawal. The same commander had already been told to clear the river of boats and ferries, and to hold every crossing site on his front under watch at night. One of the regiments on the 24th Division's front was the 17th of the ROK Army, and its commander was a colonel of 28 named Kim. Asked whether his men would hold their part of the line, he said they would stay as long as the Americans stayed. The officers who heard him believed him. Across the water, the sand beaches lay empty in the sun, and on the near bank the digging went on. Dawn on the 1st of August found the 25th Infantry Division moving toward new defensive positions south of Songju on the Central Front. At 3 that afternoon, a telephone message from the headquarters of the 8th Army reached General Keane and changed the division's plans entirely. It was to go south instead, to Samnahangjin on the Naktong. The division was already marching when the order came, and at a conference in Taegu the next morning its destination was changed again. To Masan. There was only one road for the movement, running south from Songju to Kumchon, and southeast to Weiguan on the Naktong. Foot and motor to Weiguan, then rail on to Masan. The stretch from Kumchon to Weiguan was the main supply road of the Central Front, carrying supplies north as the division came south, with ample opportunity for delay. All through the night of the 2nd and 3rd, at Weiguan, heavy equipment and weapons were loaded, the 155mm howitzers among them. By 6, the last men, dust-covered from the trucks of the 73rd Truck Company, were in boxcars and gondolas, and within the hour the last of the equipment was loaded and going south. The 35th Infantry closed in at Masan at 10 in the morning of the 3rd, and the 24th Infantry at 7:30 that evening. During the day, General Keane took command of all United Nations troops south of the Naktong. The division had completed 150 miles by foot, motor and rail within 36 hours. Where the reserves would sit had been settled beforehand. In planning the perimeter's defense, the 8th Army believed it needed at least 2 reserve forces, one near Gyeongsan, 10 miles southeast of Taegu, to bolster the center or the Pohangdong area on the east coast, and another near Samnongjin and Mi Ryung, against a breakthrough along the lower Naktong or the Masan corridor. 2 were not enough for the doors that existed. There were 4 ways to come at Pusan, past Masan below the junction of the Nam and the Naktong, through the river's Bulge to the road and rail at Mi Ryung, through Taegu, and through Gyeongju down the east coast. In August, all 4 were tried at once, and whatever stood in reserve was almost always on a road or a train. The 1st Provisional Marine Brigade had not been meant for the perimeter at all. It had been meant for a landing behind the enemy's line, and conditions on arrival in Far Eastern waters required that it be unloaded at Pusan instead. On the ground, the brigade came to some 4,500 men and 266 officers, with about 1,500 more in its air component. It had brought something new with it as well. 4 two-seat helicopters and 7 pilots, detached from a squadron at Quantico in July. The first helicopter pilots in the American forces put together as a unit for service overseas. Its assignment came at 25 minutes past 11 on the night of the 2nd. West to the Changwon area, in 8th Army Reserve, with no further move to be ordered by anyone but General Walker himself. If an emergency arose and contact with the Army was lost, the brigade would fall under the commander of the 25th Division. Between 6:30 and 7 on the morning of the 3rd, the main body left Pusan by road and rail, heavy equipment and tanks riding on flat cars. 1 battalion, gone ahead just after 6, made 40 miles by truck to a point west of Changwon by 2 in the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, everything but 1 tank platoon was in the area. Masan 6.5 miles further on. The enemy's advance through the Chinju and Masan corridor drew every reinforcement then arriving in Korea into that one corner, and the moves inside it were short, counted in hours. 1 battalion left Changwon at 20 minutes to 11 on the 6th, and was in Chindong-nae in less than 2 hours. Another left at 2 the next morning and reached it by about 5. The trucks unloaded in a schoolyard turnaround at the foot of Hill 255, where a jam of vehicles, men, and equipment nearly stopped movement along the main supply road, the heavy traffic working the ground into mud. Told by radio to keep his trucks moving under fire, the battalion commander answered that the delay was the mud and not the enemy, while Colonel Murray waited in his jeep as the column inched in. On the 9th of August, the 8th Army had a report that regular North Korean units were in the hills northwest of Pohangdong, threatening the coast road and the airfield at Yeonil. The next day it formed a task force there out of 2 ROK regiments, an anti-guerrilla battalion, a ROK Marine battalion, and 1 American artillery battery. And the ROK Army raised a fresh regiment in Taegu and sent it east. At 25 minutes to 6 that evening, General Walker sent an order by courier to Gyeongsan, the place marked out on the 4th of August as the reserve for the center and for the Pohangdong area, directing the rest of the 9th Infantry to Yeonil Airfield. The force went under General Bradley and reported directly to Walker. After dark, it took the main road through Gyeongju, and the command group and 1 battalion reached the field just before midnight. At 20 minutes past 1 in the morning of the 11th, 10 miles north of Gyeongju, a rifle company and 4 artillery vehicles were fired on at Tongnam-ni, where the road rounds the foot of a steep hill and is pressed against the river. The lead truck stopped and blocked the road, and about 120 men of the company came through to Gyeongju. In the early evening, 5 tanks were taken up the same road from Ongangne and reached the field about 8:30. Pohangdong itself became a no-man's land. Patrols from both sides entered the town at night and neither side held it. The fighting swirled around it on the hills above, and it cost both sides dearly. On the 13th, the fighter squadrons flew off Yeonil to a base on Kyushu. The army unit stayed, and the field was never brought under effective fire. North of the town, the 3rd Division of the ROK Army had been cut off along the coast road since the 10th, its perimeter shrinking back to the water, with a cruiser and 3 destroyers offshore doing its shooting for it. On the 15th, the 8th Army ordered the division taken out by sea. Loading began at Toksongne on the night of the 16th, and the last landing ship pulled off the beach at 7 in the morning with more than 9,000 men, 1,200 police, and 1,000 laborers. The ships went 20 air miles down the coast to Kuryongpori and were in by 10:30, and the division took up position south of Pohangdong the following day. The 27th Infantry was ordered from Taegu to Osan on the 30th of August, started at 8 the next morning with its men by rail and its vehicles by road, and was in by 8:30 that evening. On the same principle, a field artillery battalion, less 1 battery, was taken out of the Gyeongju and Pohangdong area, where the fighting had been running for days already, and sent across the perimeter to add its fire north of Taegu. It arrived the following day, 7 air miles above the place where the Naktong turns east and takes in the Nam. The river swings out in a wide half-circle to the west. The ground inside the loop is almost surrounded by water, 4 miles from east to west and 5 from north to south. Yongsan stands 6 miles east of the river, at the road junction behind it. American troops called this ground the Naktong Bulge. The line along that stretch belonged to the 24th Infantry Division, which held about 34 miles of river front. 1 battalion of the 34th Infantry had a front of about 9 miles. Army doctrine of the time considered 10,000 yards a normal front for a division at full strength. The battalion's 3 rifle companies stood on hills above the water, and between 2 of them lay an unoccupied gap of more than 3 miles. By day, the posts along the river were little more than observation points. After dark, they became listening posts and small, tight perimeters, some held by no more than half a squad. They were a screen. The first enemy crossings of the Naktong came on the 5th of August at 3 different places. 2 were above Waiguan in the sector of the Republic of Korea Army. The third was 30 miles below Waiguan, opposite Osan, at the lower end of the Bulge. At midnight, red and yellow flares went up over the river there, and about 1,000 men began to cross. Most of them stripped and rolled clothing and weapons into bundles they carried on their heads, going in until the water stood at their shoulders. On the east bank they dressed, formed column of platoons, and moved off up a draw that led into the American positions. Not one unit brought mortars or heavy weapons over. At 2 in the morning, the regiment reported an infiltration between 2 of its companies. By the morning of the 7th, the enemy held most of Cloverleaf Hill and Obongni Ridge. Together they make a wall across the road that runs east through the Bulge to Osan, 3 miles in from the water. Cloverleaf is the higher, shaped like a 4-leaf clover with a stem to the north. Obongni is 1.5 miles of ridge, a line of knobs 300 to 500 feet above the paddy at its foot. The road passes between them through a winding gap, and from the crests above it the American supply road could be seen as far as Osan. On the 3rd night, about 2 more battalions came over at 4 different places. On the night of the 10th, the division finished a bridge at the Kihong Ferry, in the middle of the Bulge, and brought over trucks, heavy mortars, and about 12 artillery pieces before daylight. The bridges were built of sandbags, logs, and rock, and their roadway lay about a foot below the surface of the water. What they came to was a shallow ford with a firm bottom, and in a muddy river they were hard to see from the air. 5 days after the first men waded over, there were heavy weapons and vehicles on the east bank. Osan came under artillery fire for the first time on the 11th. And that day, the enemy also cut the road at the Namjiri Bridge downstream, the only direct road link between the 24th Division and the 25th. The attack meant to push the enemy back into the river went in the same day and failed. That evening, the division commander told the force in the Bulge to stop attacking, dig in and hold. To close the pass on the road to Miryang, the division put together about 135 men out of 8 different units, clerks, bakers, military police, and gave them 2 tanks. In the Bulge itself, the 3 rifle companies of 1 battalion together had fewer men in them than a single company at full strength. And 1 master sergeant took over his company 5 times between the 10th and the 17th. Because each time every officer in it had been put out of action. Rain began at 3 in the morning on the 14th, and the low cloud on the crests kept the aircraft away. The division artillery, reckoned then at about 40% of strength, brought most of its guns together west of Osan and fired 10 minutes before the infantry started up. 1 battalion lost 60 men in an hour on Cloverleaf. On the 15th, the attack was stopped. The army commander came to the division command post that day and gave it the Marine Brigade, which had been resting near Miryang. The brigade was attached on the 15th, with orders to attack as early as it could on the 17th. The date belonged to the carriers. The Badoang Strait and the Sicily would not be in position to fly their corsairs off before then. The attack opened at 8 in the morning with 54 howitzers in support and 18 corsairs working over Obongni ahead of the infantry. 2 companies crossed the valley in 4 assault platoons, about 120 men, and went up the bare slope. The fire that stopped them came not from the crest in front, but from a village across the road to the north and from the left. 1 platoon leader reached the top twice. The second time he started with 15 men and had 9 there. Just before 4 in the afternoon, the division artillery began a scheduled shoot on Cloverleaf, and at 4, the Army battalion on that side and the Marines went forward together. Cloverleaf was taken without difficulty. With that fire put down, a platoon worked around the northern spur of Obongni and came out on the crest above the road, and the next 2 knobs were taken from there. Just before dark, 4 T-34s came down the road toward the gap between the ridges, the first enemy tanks in this fight, and 3 Pershings at the bend of the road, and the recoilless rifles took all 4. The company that held the new crest through the night had dug in with 190 men and 5 officers. The attack came at 2:30 in the morning and it cleared its own perimeter in 45 minutes. At daylight it had nobody left fit to fight. After the sun came up, the men beside them went south along the ridge and were stopped on a slope by machine gun fire. A Corsair put a 500-pound bomb on the position, and 5 minutes later they were on top. The same thing was done at the next knobs, and by dark 1 small pocket was left on Obongni. Around midday, observers and forward companies reported groups of the enemy working back west toward the river. The artillery shifted onto the crossing sites, and men of the 19th Infantry, on a hill above the water, watched parties of 10 and 15 out in the current. On the morning of the 19th, the Marines and units of the 34th Infantry met at the Naktong, and by evening the patrols along the river found nobody. Of the heavy equipment left behind, 34 artillery pieces were counted, 18 of them in a line along the road from Yongsan to the river. The fight for the first Bulge had begun on the 5th of August and taken 2 weeks. That afternoon the brigade was released from the 24th Division and went back into Army Reserve. It concentrated near Changwon, east of Masan, and stayed there until the 1st of September. North of Daegu, the country closes in. 2 roads come down out of the hills, one from Kunwi to the northeast and one from Songju to the northwest, and they meet at a village called Cheonpyeongdong. Below that junction they become a single road running into a natural corridor between 2 mountains, Yuhak-san on one side and Ka-san on the other, and the corridor leads down into the basin where Daegu sits. Below the junction the road runs almost straight, north and south, with high ground on both sides. The men who fought along that stretch in August gave it a name that stuck, and the name went into the official history afterward, the Bowling Alley. It is about a mile long. 8th Army had its headquarters in the basin at the end of that road. A force coming down the corridor would not have to break the line anywhere else. It would only have to keep walking. The North Korean 13th Division reached the corridor on the 17th of August. Getting there had taken it a week of fighting against 2 Republic of Korea regiments in the high ground at Yuhak-san, and one of its own regimental commanders said afterward that the division had lost 1,500 men doing it. Another division came in on its left, at Kunwi, 25 miles north of Daegu, with orders to come down the corridor beside it. What followed was not a battle. It was the same battle over and over, at night, for about a week. On the 19th, before any of that, Walker had spent the day feeding units into the shoulders of the corridor. A Korean battalion out of reserve to close a gap that had opened between 2 divisions on the ridges, and an American regiment brought up to stand in a circle around 2 field artillery battalions 8 miles north of the city. None of it was a counterattack. It was the ordinary business of making sure that the road stayed narrow. The shape of it was always close to the same. The attack came after dark, down the road, with tanks and self-propelled guns in a column and infantry on both sides of the road. Other units went at the Korean positions on the ridges above, and the Americans in the valley had worked out by then what to do about all of it. They had noticed that the other side used flares to signal, and that green ones meant an attack on that particular sector. So the 27th Infantry got hold of green flares of its own, and once an attack was underway, it fired them over its own main positions, which confused the attackers and often drew them toward the strongest points on the line. Mines became the other half of the routine. Every evening the regiment laid an anti-tank field across the road and the stream bed about 150 yards in front of the infantry, with trip flares in it, and a second belt of mines laid on top of the ground 100 yards ahead of the buried ones. At night, the mines stopped the tanks. The infantry came forward to lift them, and while they were doing that, flares lit the place, and artillery and mortar fire that had been registered on it in daylight came down. The largest of these nights was the 21st of August, going into the 22nd. Shelling of the regiment's area went on almost until midnight. Then the 13th Division came on in strength against the Korean units on the heights and the Americans in the valley together, with 9 tanks and several self-propelled guns down the road. Company C stood highest and furthest forward, and so was usually the first to know. Its commander telephoned that he could hear tanks in front of him, and when the artillery put up an illuminating round, he counted 19 vehicles in the column on the road below. The tanks came on firing fast, and most of what they fired went over and fell in the rear areas. The infantry came up on both sides of them. American artillery and mortars worked at separating the two, and the machine guns held their fire until the infantry was in the minefield and close. The Pershing on the forward position held its fire longer still. It began at 125 yards, with the lead tank knocked out. A bazooka team took the self-propelled gun that was third in the column. The tank trapped between them was hit and abandoned. Artillery and 90mm tank fire accounted for 7 more tanks, 3 more self-propelled guns, and a number of trucks and carriers. The fight lasted about 5 hours, and the fire from both sides was heavy the whole time. One field artillery battery supporting a single battalion fired 1,661 rounds that night. A mortar platoon fired 902. By first light, the column on the road had been destroyed. Patrols went out and counted, and on that count, the enemy loss for the night was reported as about 1,300 men. Prisoners taken later said their units had been reduced to something like a quarter of their strength. In the morning, a patrol went up the road. 2 platoons of infantry and 3 tanks. It got about a mile before it stopped. Along the way, it burned out 5 tanks with thermite grenades, machines that had been disabled in the night and left where they stood. And it found among the wrecked column an anti-tank gun, 2 self-propelled guns, and a heavy mortar. At the farthest point it reached, in the yard of a village school, it found 1 more tank abandoned and destroyed that too. The day after was a Sunday, and quiet by comparison. Aircraft worked the hills all day, so close in front of the infantry that spent 50 caliber cases fell into American foxholes, and the recognition panels came away spotted with holes. At 10 in the morning on the 22nd, 3 miles north of Ta Bu Dong, the commander of the artillery regiment attached to the 13th Division walked out toward the Korean positions with a white flag. He gave the locations of his guns. That evening, the moon was bright enough to outline enemy tanks against the dark side hills as they came down the narrow green valley. And it began again. It ended without a decision. On the 23rd, at 25 minutes to 2 in the afternoon, the regimental commander reported from the bowling alley that the 13th Division had blown the road in front of him, mined it, and was pulling back. The next day the front was quiet, apart from a recovery crew coming up to drag out a T-34 stuck just short of the American minefield. And a loose mine, shifted under the tank by the churned earth, going off as the tractor took the strain. A little after midnight, what had by then become the regular nightly attack down the bowling alley came again. 2 companies of infantry with a few tanks, and was broken up like the others. 2 more tanks were destroyed by artillery. It was the 27th Infantry's last night there. Walker had already decided to take the regiment out and put it somewhere else, and a Korean battalion moved up to take over the corridor. The road stayed where it was. It had been there before all of this, running straight down between the 2 mountains into the basin, and for about a week it had been the most carefully watched mile of ground in Korea. The hills along the Naktong in the summer of 1950 were hot, and they were dry. Korea's climate is continental rather than oceanic, for all the sea on 3 sides of the peninsula, and the monsoon rains normally come between June and September. July and August normally bring about 20 inches of rain. In 1950, they brought about a quarter of that. The early summer of that year was one of drought, and as such it was unusual. Over the southern tip of the peninsula, the sky stayed cloudless, and the heat there often reached 105 degrees, and sometimes 120. Those readings belong to the southern end of the line, the country around Osan and the southwestern corner, and not to the whole of the perimeter. For the rest of the contour there are no temperature figures at all. The summer is recorded there in words instead of numbers. On the 16th of July, on the river line to the north, the temperature reached 100 degrees by noon, and the day was light from 5 in the morning until 9 at night. The men who fought through it called it an unending day of battle. Those are the days that were written down. Between them the reports say furnace hot, and blazing hot, and hot and sultry, and leave it at that. The Naktong hills carried little vegetation, and good water was scarce. Slopes ran as steep as 60 degrees, and a ridge had to be climbed with everything a man needed carried on him. The blazing sun, together with the effort of the climb, brought on frequent throbbing headaches. The units doing it had never trained on ground like that. Climbing that ground in that weather was work in itself. Before anything else happened on it, salt tablets became a supply item of the highest priority, and they were even dropped to troops by plane. Water was the other one. Men filled canteens from streams and out of shell holes when there was nothing else to fill them from. There was a phrase that went round the army that summer, and it was about water and not about the enemy. Water in Korea is deadlier than bullets. On the 7th of August, above Chindong-nae in the southwest, the day was furnace hot and the reading was 112 degrees. The 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines came off that hill with about 30 cases of heat prostration. In that action, it was 6 times the number of its battle casualties. The next day, on the same ridges, the 3rd Battalion of the same regiment took 70 casualties, and half of them were from the heat. On the 10th of August, in the first American counterattack in the southwest, losses from heat again ran far beyond losses from fire. That week the thing was set down plainly. In the first week of the counterattack, among the newly arrived Marine and Army units, the slopes and the heat together cost more men than the enemy's bullets did. On the 9th and 10th of August, on Triangulation Hill above Wagwan, the day was very hot, and many men of the 1st Battalion of the 5th Cavalry went down from the heat inside the attack itself. The attack was turned back. On the 13th, at Yongsan, the 1st Battalion of the 23rd Infantry went into the first action of its war and had 9 cases of heat prostration and 1 battle casualty. Dysentery ran through the units in the line and at times took a quarter of a company's strength off the hill. Water and load moved the other way, carrying parties of 50 Korean civilians with 4 soldiers as escort, crossed the river under loads for the men on the far side. On the 9th, on the coastal road, a Marine battalion relieved an Army battalion on a hill the Army battalion had held for 3 days. Reliefs of that kind were the exception. Through July, the units in the line had been in almost continuous action. Non-battle casualties stayed high in every division through August, and many of them were from heat prostration. In the 9th Infantry alone, there were 419 of them in the month. On the 25th of August, the 24th Division stood at about 10,600 men and needed some 8,000 replacements to be whole again. The ration in the line was the sea-rationed, dry, issued in a cardboard box, 1 box to a man for a day. At the far end of the line, it came down at times to a single can of it a man for a day. For the first month of the war, there were no sea rations in Korea at all. Only bulk rations packed 5 in 1, and what field ration existed came out of old stock. The boxes were carried up the last stretch by hand, because nothing else could carry them there. Until September, the soldier of the South Korean Army carried a bag of rice. In September, a ration for him was finally settled at 3,165 calories a day, computed for an active man of 130 pounds. Canned fish, field biscuit, barley, rice, kelp, and tea, with additions drawn from American stocks. It had taken until the 3rd month of the war to write that down. The A-frame, a wooden pack frame carried on a man's back, was the ordinary way of moving a load up into the Korean hills, and from August onward it moved a great deal of what the line needed. Korean laborers and porters worked for the American divisions at an average of about 500 men to a division, and by then the divisions were using Korean labor for nearly all unskilled work. A porter was paid 500 won a day in a rice ration. 4,000 won went to the dollar. Korean recruits taken into the American companies were used above all in the heavy weapons companies, where machine guns, mortars, recoilless rifles, and their ammunition had to go up such ground by hand. The reports of the time call it a grueling job. The plan was to put 30 to 40,000 of them into the 4 American divisions in Korea and the ones still in Japan. They dug positions and camouflaged them, which was the other work of every day. What a unit had on a hilltop was what had been carried up to that hilltop. Dust came with the dry weather and then stayed. Large clouds of it hung over the roads in the heat, and in a column, the second vehicle kept well back from the first because of it. Men and equipment went about dust-caked, and the dust was in the food, and in the weapons, and in the water that was carried. Over all of it, from first light until dark, there was the sound of a light aircraft engine somewhere above. The 5th Air Force kept 29 observation planes, T-6s called Mosquitoes, working off the strip at Taegu. Late in August, the weather still held. On the 21st and the 22nd on Buksan above the southern coast, hot and sultry air made the climb up the slope an exhausting piece of work, with nothing else added to it. The day was still light from 5 in the morning until 9 at night. There was little shade anywhere in southern Korea. Along the lower Naktong, the last hours of August were warm and full of fog. The North Korean Fort Corps went forward before midnight on the 31st, and the river was crossed at points from Gyeongpung to the sea. The crossings fell in the zones of the American 2nd and 25th Divisions. One pushed against the whole front at the same hour. It ran through the night and did not stop at daylight. The attack was organized in 5 groupings, and the last went in on the evening of the 2nd of September. One drove at the 25th Division toward Masan, and one through the 2nd Division toward Miryang via Changnyong and Yongsan. The other 3 went at Taegu, at the corridor east of Taegu, and at Pohangdong, and toward Gyeongju. About 98,000 men had been brought up near the front by the 1st of September, and roughly a third of them were untrained recruits. At the Kihang ferry, the fog came down on the river at 8 in the evening. At 9, dogs began barking on the far bank, and barked in the silence until the first mortar rounds fell at 10. At 10:30, the fog lifted, and Sergeant Ernest R. Kuma saw a bridge 2/3 built across the river before him. He put the 90mm gun of his tank on it, took the 50 caliber machine gun, and a minute's firing brought the bridge down. Operation Manchu was canceled 5 minutes before midnight. A rifle company had been going to cross at the Pekchin ferry, and the offensive came down on its support groups at the foot of Hill 209, while still setting up their weapons. On top of the hill, the battalion chaplain heard a swishing sound in the water below, and through his glasses, he made out soldiers wading the river. At 2 in the morning, a truck stopped at the foot of the hill. A whistle blew, an order came, and men started up the slope. Between 2:30 and 3:30, the fighting reached the pass between Cloverleaf Hill and the Obongni Ridge. By first light, the best defensive ground between Yongsan and the river was gone. The 23rd Infantry had taken over a 16,000-yard front on the river on the 29th of August, without its 3rd Battalion. At 3 in the morning, its Company C was overrun. 7 men were collected afterward, and 3 days later, fewer than 20 remained. By morning, it was clear that a hole had been driven through the middle of the 2nd Division, 6 miles wide and 8 miles deep. At 20 minutes past 10, the division was formally divided and run as 2 commands, one north of the break and one south. Light aircraft of the division artillery searched for cut-off units all day and made 14 drops of ammunition, food, and water. Liaison planes left the strip every hour of the day. At 9 that morning, Walker asked the Air Force for its maximum effort along the river from Toksongdong south to cut the battlefield off from its rear. The 7th Fleet turned away from its strikes near Incheon and came south. An hour before noon, the Marine Brigade was told to move, and it was ready by 1:30. The 25th Division had been holding a front of nearly 30 miles. From the bridge at Namji-ri, round to the coastal road at Chindong-ni. Keane asked Walker for leave to commit the rest of the 27th Infantry, and was refused. By the middle of the day, he put in its 2nd Battalion on his own authority, and Walker approved it afterward. The order for an immediate counterattack at Hamon reached the command post at 2:45, and the battalion attacked at 4:30 with 8 tanks and infantry riding on them. Under a heavy ground fog the next morning, the enemy counterattacked there, and at noon, the 1st Battalion moved back into the same holes, the heavy weapons still standing. Around the 5th of September, 8th Army discussed falling back to a shorter line nearer Pusan. The staff worked through the night and the orders were typed by 5 in the morning. The line itself had been traced in August, from Sodong-ne on the east coast west across the high ground to a point northeast of Mi-ryang, and it carried the name of the engineer who laid it out. At Yongsan on the 1st of September the 9th, infantry had almost nothing left to hold the town, and Kaiser gave it the 2nd Engineer Combat Battalion. A column came through the town toward an engineer roadblock about 3 the next morning and opened fire when challenged. There were 4 tanks and up to a battalion of infantry in Yongsan. The engineers fought until 11 with no artillery and no mortar support, using 9 new 3.5-inch launchers and 9 old 2.36-inch ones. At 3 in the afternoon, tanks and the reassembled 2nd Battalion took the town back. The Marine Brigade was attached to the 2nd Division at 1:15 on the 2nd, and its attack began at 5 minutes to 9 the next morning across the rice fields. Marine tanks burned 4 T-34s, and the crew of a 5th abandoned it. Heavy rain fell that night. The other side was strangely quiet, and the 4th came in clear. At 8 the advance went on again against almost nothing, and 1 battalion walked onto what had been a division command post, tents still standing and 2 abandoned T-34s beside them. On the East Coast, the 3rd of September was the day Walker faced 5 separate dangerous situations at once, from Pohangdong round to Masan. At 1:30 that morning, a division of about 5,000 men went in south of the Kigye Valley, and by dawn it was on the lateral road 3 miles east of Angangni, 5 miles in a night. The enemy was in Angangni the next night at 2:20, and by 4 American tanks had stopped firing. Friend and foe mixed together. By midday on the 4th roadblock stood 3 miles from Gyeongju, and Pohangdong was in enemy hands again on the 6th. In the corridor east of Taegu, a division reported at 3,600 men reached Yongchon in 4 days, and was in the town by the middle of the 6th, and South Korean regiments cleared most of it 2 days later. From the 8th to the 10th, the fighting on the ridges toward Gyeongju went on under typhoon rain, the cloud too low for aircraft. The rain stopped on the 10th. North of Taegu, the 1st Cavalry Division held a long front. On the 12th, a battalion counting 535 men the day before attacked Hill 314 with air support only, for want of shells for a preparation. It went up at 11 and had the hill at 3:30. 229 of its men were hit in the first 2 hours. 1 company came out with fewer than 40 effectives, and another lost every officer it had. Ammunition was short along the whole line by then. On the 10th, 8th Army cut the daily allowance of 105mm rounds from 50 to 25 a howitzer, except in extremity, and a battalion with the first 8-inch howitzers in Korea could not fire for want of shells. Heavy rain on the 8th and 9th raised the Nam and the Naktong by more than 2 feet. Near Changnyeong on the 9th, the 23rd Infantry was reckoned at 38% of combat efficiency. And at one point that day, the regimental reserve was 6 men. On the 9th as well, an American aircraft put a 500-pound bomb through the 80-foot center span of the bridge at Namji-ri. It had been held all the way through by 1 platoon with a tank and a single howitzer the platoon called "Pego My Heart." By the middle of September, one thing was known along the whole line. A landing behind the enemy's lines was coming, and the date set for it was the 15th of September. The knowledge had become widespread among the United Nations forces in Korea. On the hills themselves, it changed nothing. The news of the landing reached the troops of the 8th Army at once, on the 15th. The North Korean units in front of them were apparently not allowed to have it for several days more. The battle line in the south lay 180 air miles from the landing area at its closest point, and much farther by the winding mountain roads. For the men on the Naktong, it was happening somewhere else. 8th Army had issued its plan for the attack on the 6th of September, revised it on the 11th, and made it an operational directive on the 16th. It set the hour of attack at 9 in the morning, one day after the Incheon landing, and Walker himself had asked that it not begin any earlier. Most of his staff officers were not too confident that the Army could break out with what it had. What it had was thin. Artillery ammunition was rationed even for the attack, and there was bridging enough for only 2 floating crossings of the Naktong. Of all the divisions under the 8th Army, only one was not tied down in a fight of its own, and it came over from the East Coast in pieces on the eve of the attack. The morning of the 16th of September came up over southern Korea, with murky skies and heavy rain. The weather was bad enough that the Air Force canceled a saturation bombing planned against the enemy positions in the Waegwon area. The general attack set for 9 o'clock did not swing into motion everywhere at the appointed hour, for the simple reason that in many places the North Koreans were attacking and the United Nations troops were defending. In most sectors, an observer would have found that morning little different from the 15th or the 14th or the 13th. It was the same perimeter situation, attack and counterattack, and the fight for the hills had merely gone on into another day. Only in a few places was anything gained. North of Taegu, one regiment of the 1st Republic of Korea Division worked past the enemy strongpoint at the walled city, and in the south, the 2nd Division pushed 5 miles to the hills above the river. In the center of that division's front, a pre-dawn attack came through the perimeter of one rifle company and cost it 25 casualties, among them all of the company officers. By afternoon, on the same front, the North Koreans began leaving their positions and going back toward the river. The weather cleared and airstrikes came in over the crossings. That night, the command post of the division facing them went over the water, and its regiments followed. On the evening of the 17th, the Chief of Staff of the 8th Army spoke to Tokyo by telephone. Things down there were ripe for something to break, he said, and they had not had a single counterattack all day. The next morning, patrols of the 38th Infantry went down to the Naktong west of Changnyong and found the heights on the far bank empty. 2 squads crossed in 2-man rubber boats. A platoon followed, and the regimental commander asked permission to go over in strength. At 20 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, the division chief of staff gave it. It was the first lasting crossing of the river by any part of the 8th Army, and it came 2 days ahead of the division's own schedule. At another ferry site on the 19th, the battalion of the 23rd Infantry crossed in assault boats and found the surprise complete. A map picked up on the far bank gave the positions of 3 enemy divisions in the country to the west. Supply followed on very little. The division had 276 feet of bridging in all, and with that, and with expedience, it got a bridge over a 400-foot stream by the evening of the 22nd. Until then, everything over there had gone by hand. North of Taegu, the ground still went the way it had gone all month, along the same two corridors. On the Top Budong Road, the North Koreans sat on the hills above the city, 6 miles from it. On the road from Waegwan, one hill held for 3 days and cost a tank company 9 tanks, 6 of them on mines. It fell on the 18th, and Waegwan was taken on the 19th. The break in that sector was made by the 1st Republic of Korea Division. Its 12th Regiment found a gap in the high mountains, went through it, and came out on the road from Tabudong to Kunwi, about 13 miles ahead of the most forward elements of the 1st Cavalry Division. That put it on one of the enemy's roads north, and on the 19th 2 North Korean regiments came off the southern slopes of Kasan. On the evening of the 25th field, telephone lines were run out to a forward echelon of the 1st Cavalry Division at a river crossing, and before midnight, the call came over them. The division could go all the way to a junction with the Corps from Incheon if it could manage it. The next morning, its commander gathered his commanders in a school building at Songju. At noon, the division would start moving, day and night, until it met them. The leading column left Poon at 11:30. A reconnaissance platoon and a tank platoon in front, under orders to run at maximum tank speed and not to fire unless fired on. Mile after mile, there was nothing in front of them but South Korean villagers along the road, cheering as the column went by. Cheongju in the middle of the day was empty, except for a few civilians. After 64 miles, the tanks ran dry where the fuel truck never arrived. 3 of the 6 were filled from cans collected along the column. Just after that, in almost full darkness, 3 North Korean trucks drove into the column, and their drivers left them standing, and there was gasoline enough on them for the other 3 tanks. At 8:30, the column went on with its headlights burning. Chonan, on the main Seoul highway, was full of enemy soldiers, and they stood and watched it pass, not knowing which way to turn at the crossroads there. The tank platoon leaders stopped, pointed, and asked the North Korean soldiers standing guard one word, Osan, and got a nod, just as the man saw what he was and ran. 10 miles short of the town, they heard tank and artillery fire ahead, and the lights went out. At 26 minutes past 10 that night, 3 tanks went through Osan at speed and came up on the positions of the 31st Infantry. The men there held their fire because the speed and the engine noise and the headlights made them doubt this was the enemy. And a phosphorus grenade lit the white star on the hull in time. Mines had been lifted from the road just before the tanks came up it. The contact between the 2 forces was entered in the records at 26 minutes past 8 the next morning, the 27th of September, at a small bridge just north of Osan. From the 4th of August to the 16th of September was 43 days, and almost everything about them was counted by somebody at the time. The counting began with people. On the 19th of August, every American unit still in Japan was ordered to give up part of its own strength to Korea. And by the 6th of September, that order had moved 229 officers and 2,201 enlisted men across the strait. On the 19th of August, the Republic of Korea Army stood at 84,824 men, 61,000 of them in combat units. Along the southern coast, the enemy at the end of August stood within 30 miles of Pusan. Inside the perimeter, there were about 500 miles of railroad, and on the 30th of August, a railway operating battalion arrived from the United States to run them. Supplies went by rail from Pusan to the division railheads, and by truck from there to the regiments and battalions. By the end of August, all 4 American divisions had at last brought their regiments up to the normal 3 battalions, the shortage they had crossed the strait with in July. The 27th and 35th Infantry got their 3rd battalions early in the month, out of 2 battalions of another regiment. In the same weeks, Japanese contractors took a contract to build 68,000 vehicles for the Republic of Korea Army, mostly cargo trucks and dump trucks. During August, 11,115 officers and men came into Korea as replacements from Japan and the United States. 6 medium tank battalions landed in the same month, 5 of them in the first 8 days, and the battalions averaged 69 tanks each. By the beginning of September, there were about 600 American medium tanks inside the perimeter, and 20 had been lost in battle by the 22nd of August. In July, the Far East Air Forces flew 4,635 sorties in close support of the ground troops. In August, they flew 7,397, which came to about 40 sorties a day for each American division. In the middle of September, the combat units of the 8th Army and the Republic of Korea Army came to about 140,000 men. 4 American divisions averaged 15,000 apiece, and more than 9,000 South Korean recruits were serving inside them. 6 Korean divisions averaged 10,000. With the Corps and Army headquarters, the number came to more than 150,000. 4 American divisions had passed through the perimeter: the 24th, the 25th, the 2nd Infantry, and the 1st Cavalry. With them were the 5th Regimental Combat Team, which had become the 3rd regiment of one of those divisions, the medium tank battalions, and 4 regimental tank companies. Rifle strength was uneven all summer. By the middle of September, some companies were down to 50 effective men or fewer, about a quarter of full company strength. Battle casualties in the 8th Army for August ran to 1,941 in the 24th Division, 1,800 in the 25th, and 1,503 in the 1st Cavalry. Losses among officers were heavy in all 3. 6 divisions of the Republic of Korea Army were in the line under Lieutenant General Chung-il Kwon. The 1st, the 3rd, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, and the Capital Division. They held the most mountainous ground and the worst roads, and had 1/4 the artillery of the American divisions. By the 10th of September, each of the 6 had an American battalion of 105 mm howitzers attached to it. The British 27th Infantry Brigade sailed from Hong Kong on the 25th of August, 1,300 miles in 5 ships, and moored at Pusan on the 29th. It went up by train the same night to an assembly area 10 miles southeast of Daegu, and on the 5th of September, it took its place in the line. These were the first ground troops in Korea from any country but the United States. The 1st Provisional Marine Brigade existed for 67 days. In 1 month, it was put into 3 heavy attacks and covered 380 miles of road on a third of its own transport, with Army trucks making up the rest. Its losses were 148 killed, 15 dead of wounds, 9 missing, and 730 wounded. At 1 minute past midnight on the 13th of September, it was dissolved, and its units took back their old designations. Of the nearly 2,000 men who came into Korea with the 34th Infantry on the 3rd of July, 184 were still with the regiment at the end of August. On the 31st, the regiment was consolidated onto paper. Its 1st Battalion became the new 3rd Battalion of the 19th Infantry, and its 3rd Battalion became the new 2nd Battalion of the 21st. American battle casualties from the beginning of the war to the 15th of September came to 19,165 men. The first 15 days of September accounted for more of them than any other 15-day period of that war. Of the whole number, 4,280 were killed in action, and 12,377 were wounded, 319 of the wounded dying later. 401 men were held prisoner and 2,107 were carried as missing. The missing figure was large for a reason of bookkeeping as much as anything else. In that country, a man was entered as missing until his unit knew where he had gone, and the entry was often corrected weeks afterward. In some companies, every officer had been replaced during the summer. 8th Army Intelligence, working from what it had on the 10th of September, put the North Korean force around the perimeter at 101,417 men, in 13 infantry divisions with an armored division and 2 armored brigades, at an average of 3/4 strength. Prisoner interrogations and captured documents read afterward showed the number was far less. A fair estimate would be about 70,000. By then the word division had stopped meaning very much on that side. The chief of staff of one of them, taken prisoner, gave its strength as 2,300 men against the 8,000 in the 8th Army estimate. And he did not count 2,000 more who were untrained and had no weapons. Another division that the estimate carried at 7,000 was by that date a few hundred scattered men. A daily combat report captured on the 14th of September from one battalion listed 6 officers, 34 sergeants, and 111 privates, 151 men. Against them it listed 82 personal weapons, 3 pistols, 9 carbines, 57 rifles, and 13 automatic rifles. It listed 92 grenades, a little more than 1 for every 2 men, and 6 light machine guns with fewer than 300 rounds apiece. By the 15th of September, the United Nations forces were holding 3,380 North Korean soldiers in the 8th Army prisoner camp. 2,254 of them had been taken by Korean units, and 1,126 by the 8th Army. 2 weeks earlier, the number had been 1,753. The rectangle is still there, in the sense that the ground is still there. About 100 miles from north to south, about 50 from east to west, hills nearly all the way across, the sea on 2 sides, and the river down the west. Nothing about it looks like a position. It did not look like one then either, except in the places where men had dug. The Naktong is still the largest thing in that landscape. It comes down out of the mountains and turns east near the bottom, and goes to the sea, and in the summer it runs low and wide and slow, the way it ran that August, and in some places a man can still see the shallows, where a division once looked at the far bank and thought about crossing. There are bridges over it now, standing where bridges were blown. That is most of what a war leaves on a river. The spans go down and the piers usually survive, and afterward somebody puts a new deck across the old stone, and the traffic that crosses it has no reason to know. The port is still a port. It was the best harbor in the country before any of this, and it stayed the best harbor afterward, and the rail line that the Japanese built runs north out of it exactly where it ran then, laid on the same embankment. Almost everything that held the line came up that line. It is an ordinary railway. That was always the point of it. The circuit is still a circuit. Pusan to Miryang, Miryang to Taegu, Taegu east to Yongchon, Yongchon to Gyeongju, and Gyeongju back down to Pusan. 5 names and a loop of road and rail inside a ring of hills. It was the shape of the defense because it was the shape of the country, and it is still the shape of the country, and people drive it now for reasons that have nothing to do with any of this. North of Taegu, the 2 mountains still stand on either side of the road, and the road still runs almost straight between them for about a mile, before it bends away west. On a summer night, that mile is dark and narrow and full of the noise of insects. It is a perfectly unremarkable piece of highway. There is no way to look at it and see what it was for a week in August. The 2 smaller harbors are still on the coast as well, at Ulsan and at Suyong, where ammunition and fuel came ashore straight over the sand because there was no pier to put it on. Nothing about a beach records that kind of thing. The tide comes up over the same gradient it came up thence, twice a day, and takes whatever marks were made in the night. The line itself is the thing that did not last, and could not have. It was made of holes in the ground and wire, and mines laid at dusk and lifted at dawn, and men lying along the tops of hills where nobody would choose to live. 43 days after it closed, it stopped existing, and within a month the whole war was 300 miles north of it. Ground like that goes back to being ground very quickly. What held was not a fortification because there was not one. What held was an arrangement, 1 harbor, 3 railway lines, a loop of road inside the hills, and enough time bought by men falling back from one river to the next through July to let the ships arrive. Most of the work of that summer was carrying, digging, waiting, and riding at night to somewhere that had just gone wrong. Very little of it was decided. The days ended without conclusions and began again the same way, and the men who lived through them mostly could not have said, at the time, whether anything they had done that day had mattered. The answer to that is only visible from a long way off, which is where we are. The country between the hills is farmed. The rice comes in green in the summer, the way it was green that August in the paddies below the ridges, and the roads that were 18 feet wide and full of ox carts are wider now and full of trucks. From the air, on a clear day, it still looks like what it is. A set of corridors running between mountains, and all of them, in the end, running down to one harbor at the bottom of the peninsula. That was the whole problem, and the whole answer, and it is still lying there in plain view. Sleep well.